And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. The second hour of Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you too can learn to become a medical intuitive, energy medicine practitioner, or professional intuitive counselor. All this training is from the comfort of your own home, so please do check it out at www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. Just a couple of quick announcements for this hour, just repeating the ones from earlier. March 21st, Glen Rose, Texas, where man and dinosaur walk together. Weird Fest, Texas, because you can't get any weirder because it's in Texas. April 12th, History, Haunts, and Legends Conference in spooky Jefferson, Texas. And then if you're in Florida or, I guess, Alabama, Arkansas, Alabama, one of those A states, Alabama, is closed. I will be in Pensacola, Florida on April 13th doing a presentation for the Unlimited Horizons organization, and I will post some more information about that on the webpage. If you're in the area, would love to see you. Also, one other quick announcement. I have recently opened up a new website, www.medical-intuitives.com, where you can find out about the services I offer, and it has a it gives me a blogging opportunity, and we're going to be opening up the radio show with the same kind of thing. And so I'll keep you in tuned of, what's going on. Don't forget, sign up for the newsletter, go to the YouTube page, Just Energy Radio on YouTube, subscribe to the channel. We the channel just keeps growing more and more every day. So I want to thank you all for supporting this programming. Okay, so this hour we're going to be speaking to Avery Morrow, and his book is called The Sacred Science of Ancient Japan, Lost Chronicles of the Age of the Gods. And so let me tell you a little bit about Avery and bring him on. Avery Morrow is a graduate student with an interest in the perennial tradition and Japanese esotericism. I cannot say that word today. He spent 3 years in Japan working as an assistant to the well-known Shinto Shonichi Nakaya, visiting ancient sacred sites and teaching English. His first book, The Sacred Science of Ancient Japan, examined legends of the Golden Age when gods and people interacted. And Avery, you need to have them send me that book because I did not. Was that through Inner Traditions? Oh, hi everybody. This is Avery Morrow.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah, hello. Good evening.
Hi. But I have to ask you, was that book through Inner Traditions also?
Yeah, it was. That is the book that you were reading, right?
Sacred.
Yeah, The Sacred Science of Ancient Japan. Yeah.
Never mind. Well, you put your first book, and I'm thinking, did I miss one?
Well, I'm crossing my fingers, right? They're going to be more on the way.
Cool.
Yeah.
Because it seems, I have to tell you, I get a lot of books. I read a lot of books. You have a lot of information jam-packed in yours. It's just jam-packed.
Right. Well, it's the result of a few years of research. And at first it was just collecting all this information. And then later I started to get this idea of these things are really, they're all linked together. And it's really kind of important. And that's how it turned into a book.
So I wanted to ask you this before we went on air, but I was going to hold my tongue. So I'm going to make the assumption that you speak Japanese.
Oh, yeah, a little,
Well, like a little, or a lot, a little? You're being
enough to read my sources for this book.
Okay, that was my question, because, finding English translations of some of the books that you talk about is virtually impossible. Or at least I haven't really been able to find some of them. And then you have to trust the translation. And so did you actually get copies of these documents in Japanese and then read them for yourself?
Right. and these documents, some of them are written in ancient languages, and it's hard for even for native Japanese speakers to read them. So what I was reading was books by people who are really fascinated by these, written in Japanese mostly. But there are a few English ones, and you can find a list of links to them on my website at avery.morrow.name. And I did translate those into English myself and use them in the final book.
So, your book deals with manuscripts, but I have to tell you, my notes are so bad. I'm looking going, what? I thought it said interpretation. I'm like, well, that makes no sense. What are their importance in Japanese culture?
Right. I think in terms of the big picture of Japanese culture, these are documents that like inspire people, right? They aren't being read by a very large group of people, but for the small group that does get interested, these are like real revelations. They're telling this unknown history of what life was like in Japan before our earliest records.
And so, and I'm just, I started getting into like all of these details, and I had all these detailed questions. And I was like, maybe you need to ask broader, sweeping questions, or else we're going to get all into the nitpick. When you go across these different documents, do you find a consistency of storyline that is being portrayed?
Yeah, I think the one really consistent thing across all of these documents, and here I think you can find a parallel with other ancient legends from around the world, is that the history that they're talking about is not like like Stone Age, like caveman stuff. They're saying no. When you go far enough back in Japanese history, eventually you're arriving at a golden age, and this is an age when there were gods around the country, or maybe God is not the right word, because in Japanese you say kami, and that word might mean spirit, or it might just mean a really noble person. But anyway, we have the myths and legends about these kami, and in these parahistories that I wrote about, they said, yeah, these kami were really in the country, and they really had their own golden age kind of world where they human beings had this intimate connection with nature and the universe. And I think that's the one thing that you'll find in all of these documents.
But weren't these commies also sky people?
Right. In some of the legends, the kami start out above the earth, somewhere up there in the sky. And in the official, Japanese mythology, that's a place called Takamagahara. And the kami will send people down to earth in like a by like commanding them to go populate the world, or sending them in a big flying ship. But in these parahistories, the kami are actually living. Often they are living in Japan itself, and they have a way of life within the country, which is very interesting.
Well, that was one of the things that I found really. You were talking about the different. I didn't write the names down. Like the different. I keep thinking about like the eightfold path, but that's totally not what you talked about. Like the 5 golden ways, or I don't know. There were a bunch of different ones. Now I'm kind of like digging in here.
Yeah, right. I think I can help you out there. There's some different documents that teach their own special things, and in the second one I looked at, the Hotsumetsutae, they have a thing called the Way of Issei, and Issei is the big important shrine in Japan, and so it's a way that the country can live in harmony, and that it guarantees that people will be able to interact with each other in like a holistic and wonderful ways. And there's other documents where there are ancient scripts, such as the I believe I translated it as 8-way script or something like that. And the way the text is written and the way things are spoken or sung can also have a power on people.
What I found striking, however, was that in those different rules to live by,
Mm-hmm.
for lack of a better word, they were suggestions. They were, well, maybe you should think about this, and there were, making you really look at yourself and your relationship with other people, and there was definitely this introspective kind of feel to it. And what I found striking is that then you look at these early, law codexes that we find in the Western world, and they're all prohibitive. Don't do this, don't steal, don't kill, don't, and it just seemed like the tone and tenor between the way that the rules and the guidelines are presented in those texts are very different than what we find in the West.
Oh, absolutely. I recently at college I've been reading the texts of Taoism, which is another source of ancient tradition, and it's really shocking how very different it is from the prohibitions and commandments that we're used to, and in that it will say you just have to recognize that things are in flux and things are changing, but we're also connected. And I think that's something that you also find in these Japanese texts, where wherever they come from, that source is saying there's not going to be one strict rule that we always have to follow throughout all history. It's always going to be about reminding you about what makes you human, and it's always going to be, just sort of getting in touch with a deeper, more natural thing.
Well, let me ask a question. So are these texts pre-Buddhist doctrine? Because there definitely is, the whole, Tao thing going on. I probably am totally making a fool of myself in your mind.
No.
I'll just mix
right.
all these religions
Tao
up.
is just the Chinese word for way, and just think about it as a way to live, not a rule for living, but a way.
No, and I'm just trying to quantify. I mean, because there are people that believe that much of what we have in Japan came from China, and we know that Buddha was Chinese and he lived in 600 AD.
Right. Right.
And so do these texts actually predate the Buddhist influence, which is definitely much more of, being cool and reserved? Do they predate that whole idea?
Oh, yeah, that's actually a question I get a lot, because people are very familiar with that Japan did get its major traditions like Taoism and Confucianism and Buddhism. Those all came from China, and they came over the coast. But actually, these texts, what they claim is that they come from a much older age than that. And it's something Japanese people have been thinking about for a long time, which is, all of these teachings, they came over across the ocean to us. So there must have been some point in our history when we didn't have any of that stuff. What was life like then, right? How did people get along? How did we relate to each other without having this Chinese language? And maybe the Chinese language sets up a kind of barrier that makes it harder for people to talk in pure Japanese. And I think these texts are sort of expression of that. They say that, in the original Japanese language, we had such a poetry, such a more musical feeling that speaks more directly to Japanese people. And when you start thinking about that, you start to think about other aspects of life, of what it was like in the Golden Age. And that's when you start to see all of the variety of things that I've put in my book.
But when I was reading it, I mean, it was really a bad course, the philosophy of China and Japan, and they talked about the Eightfold Way. And, I'm thinking we're going to get into this heavy duty esoteric discussions, and it was really bad. I think that was the only thing I learned in that class, and don't ask me what they were. But anyway,
Well,
But
yeah,
it seems, but it seems like that same kind of. I guess really what my question is, if and I don't know if you've ever investigated this, but I kind of feel like you probably have. If you look at the philosophical systems that came out of China, do they have that same kind of, do unto others as you would like them to do unto you kind of mentality, where you should really look at your relationships and look at your behavior before you start acting bad?
Right. The two systems in China, and I'm glad you asked me because that's what I'm studying right now. So I can talk about that for a little bit. Confucianism is I probably what you're thinking of with these rules are how to behave towards other people. And what Confucianism is really about is like examining the unbreakable bonds in your life, right? Like the most important ones are between like parents and children, between you and your boss, unless if you're your own boss, but things that those social connections that you just can't avoid, and you shouldn't run away from them. You should try to make them as good as possible. And so that definitely that moved to Japan. And there's also Taoism, which is almost the opposite of that. It's saying you have to know that the universe is always in flux and things are always changing, and that also came to Japan. But you can see in the documents that I talk about that they are neither Confucian nor Taoist. They're actually really going for something completely different, which is how how did Japanese people conceive of their own society without having to use all this Chinese language. So I feel like this shines a new light on what we might think of as Japanese.
Hmm. Well, it just makes you wonder if maybe the Japanese didn't have some kind of influence on China, and then China kind of came back. I mean, because it seems like the Chinese philosophical system doesn't, in my mind, relate all that much to Hinduism.
Right. And that's actually a feature of some of my texts that say, Japanese people, they've been around for quite a long time. So who's to say that China was the original origin of all of these things? Why couldn't Japan have had influence on China? And definitely we do know that, that like Indian Buddhism eventually came to China, and it's all commingled together there. So I do think it's possible that these in that distant past, before we have any writing about what was going on, that these cultures could have been influencing each other in East Asia in ways that we don't yet know about.
Uh-huh. Well, and one of the things that you talk about, because I think this will give people, and I have some questions, and since you were there and you studied this, you might be able to answer my questions, because I find this interesting. But one of the things that comes out of Japan, which I think flabbergasts people, is the pottery that comes out of the Jomon. I'm sorry, yeah. I have zero phonics skills, so right, I Jomon, trash everything. I trash everything. So anyway, and those figures that, look like they have like underwater gear, and, they're just really bizarre. But there's the bizarre part, which is one piece to it. But then there is the quality of workmanship that is produced. That's what, 9,000 years old, 9,000 right. BC, which I don't think we find that kind of workmanship anywhere else.
Right. A lot of people are really fascinated by that Jomon pottery. I've only seen it a few times myself in like Japanese museums and stuff, but it's really like amazing to think what kind of culture was producing this, And when people write about it, some of them have actually relied on the documents that I talk about in my book, where they say, when you want to think about ancient Japan, let's use this language, the language that comes from this parahistory book. And I don't know if the book is real. I don't know where it came from actually, but it reflects back onto my image of what I see in that pottery. it speaks to me of a sort of like harmony with nature and taking something out of the universe and putting that into the pottery. And definitely, I feel like some of the texts that I talk about, they do seem to reflect back on what we do know about archaeology.
Are any of the texts, I mean, because that was just a region in Japan, correct?
A reach?
A region? It
Oh.
wasn't like they weren't producing that pottery in all of Japan. It was just a region in Japan, correct?
Yeah, it was the warmer parts where it's easier to live.
Well, I don't know about that. I just know about like Fukushima and, important stuff like that. But were any of these documents, did any of them come from that, and I'm going to say region, from that geographic area that we maybe can tie to that culture? I mean, maybe not the document, but the stories and stuff like that.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of interesting because some of these documents do come from that northern area where we don't have as much pottery or anything, and we don't know what the people were like up there. And so you have that guy who was in the book Sakai Katsutoki, who went around looking for pyramids and ancient mountains and sculptures up there, and where he was going was not the old like population centers. He was going to places way out in the mountains where like very few people were living, and you can't really say what life was like there 10,000 years ago. So yeah, it's there's an element of the the unexplained, the unexplored in this.
Well, and it just makes you wonder how far one culture goes back in Japan, in the general sense. But I have one other question with the Jomon period region. There is the magnificent pottery, but were there other sculptural items? Have there been other sculptural items found? Have they found any architectural remnants? Like it makes me think, okay, well, they were around the same time that we had Göbekli Tepe, and I'm just kind of going, well, maybe there were other much more advanced cultures. Have they found any kind of evidence to possibly support that?
Well, we have Sakai Katsutoki saying, yes, there are pyramids then, like tens of thousands of years ago, but we haven't had anyone confirm what he was finding in his explorations. We do have stone circles from that time, and we do have, the pottery comes in terms of like vases and those strange human sculptures. We have drums, and you can figure out how to fit in the skin to the drum and play music the way they did in the Jomon period. But other
Is
than
that those giant pots?
Yeah, right. Those giant pots, they're often labeled pots at museums, but if you look closely, you can often see little holes around the top. And I think it's not, some archaeologists said this. I think it's not unreasonable to say that they were stringing animal skins in there and they could play that as a drum.
Cool. Well, I wonder if anybody's ever tried doing that.
I haven't heard of anyone doing that with the original ancient pottery, but I know there's at least one Japanese guy who makes pots in that traditional way. They look like Jomon pots, and then he studied native music of various cultures, and he can play for himself what he would call Jomon music, and he does concerts with that. It sounds really cool to me. I've often tried to go to one of his concerts, although not yet.
That sounds pretty cool. Let's see. I'm looking on my list and trying to read through my own handwriting here. Okay, so, I mean, I'm kind of a mythology. I like reading it, and I find it a little frustrating. And so I was really glad to, one, see your book, and two, find out. I mean, because the only book that I knew of was the Koji or
the Kojiki, right?
Sorry, I call it the Koji. You just have to go with my little vocabulary today. Anyway, But I get very hesitant to go to like Amazon and buy a book that I have absolutely no idea what it's going to be about.
I think that's a good instinct, actually. With that Kojiki that you're talking about, there are two translations. One of them is the one you can find on Amazon, or like get it online. And I feel like you don't really get the feel of ancient Japan from that book. It's like 150 years old. It was translated by this like British Orientalist guy, and I don't know, but there's something missing from that. And there's another translation which is just amazing, and you really get the rhythm and the poetry from that. But that one's really hard to find, and so I attempted to summarize that in the first chapter of my book.
So in these ancient texts, I mean, this is a kind of bizarre question, but it's interesting to me. So are they written in lyrical verse?
Right. Of the 4 documents that I looked at, 2 of them are written as poetry, and I think there's good evidence for that. The ancient Japanese used a lot of poetry. Like in the Kojiki, you can often find poetry, but these texts, they're written entirely in meter, and I think that's absolutely amazing. They're written in a regular poetry. They go like 5-7-5, like a haiku. Right, and they just do that for the whole document. It's like 10,000 lines of haiku.
I can't even imagine even thinking about doing that.
I have no idea. How did they think of that? Like, what, who chose that? How did they write it down? It's an enormous mystery, and the Japanese academia just doesn't want to look at it right now because they'd have to tackle too much with this talk about this ancient Japan that they're not really sure. Is it real? Is it not? But to me, just having the document by itself, you get a feel for this, this ancient musical culture.
Well, but one of the things that I find interesting is that when you start getting into some of the really old documents, they're all written in lyrical verse, and poetic,
right.
in that kind of genre. One of the things I like looking at is parallels, and I find it fascinating that we find that same parallel, in writing coming out of ancient Japan as well.
Right, and I think you're right. This is, it's not just about ancient Japan. It's about all over the world. When people first wanted to talk and put their thoughts down in writing, they weren't mainly just writing like business like stuff. They wanted to write poetry. They wanted to write something that would be beautiful for other people, and I think that's one of the great, the most wonderful things about these parahistories is that they really have that feeling like this is the way people must have talked in ancient times. Like there must have been this astoundment, this awe when people were speaking at the natural world around them.
Well, but wasn't there also be that, when we put something to a beat or whatever, it's just easier for us to remember? So there was a certain mnemonic quality to it as well.
Right. I think that's how things went in the ancient Greek epics, like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And in that one text that I was looking at, the Hotsumotstai, they actually have some of those features where they're putting things to a beat because it's easier to remember. Like a person's name will come with a nickname or something like that, so that it matches the rhythm better. And that's kind of fascinating. Like wherever that came from, whoever wrote that, they were familiar with that kind of tradition. And I think that deserves further investigation.
I just find that it's interesting that all different cultures embrace the same tradition.
Right, absolutely. And I tried to document various points in these texts where they're matching up with the ancient texts from around the world. Like in the Takenouchi documents, it talks about, in the beginning, the human lifespans were really long, like thousands of years. And then as time went on, we moved into these more corrupt eras, and they got shorter and shorter until now we arrive at the shortest era, and people can only live for like 100 years. And when I read that, I'm like, whoa, this is just like the ancient Hindu texts. And so I met with the guy who is the current person in charge of those documents, and I talked with him and said, are you aware that there's Indian texts that say just the same thing as this? He had never heard of it before. He wasn't interested in anything that wasn't his document in particular. But that is kind of that's kind of astounding. Like, even though they're separated by thousands of miles of land and ocean, people came up with this same idea. Like, this is how. This is a history of the human spirit. This is what it was like thousands or millions of years ago, or something like that.
Well, actually, I mean, you find it's the same thing in Egypt, the same thing in Mesopotamia, Sumerian culture. It's a pretty. It's a pretty common thing. How far back, has anybody ever, done like the genealogy or the lineage? I mean, one of the things that they did in Sumeria, for example, there is the Sumerian kings list. And what they discovered was that there was one of the kings that were named on the list was actually a historic figure. And so using his name, they were able to go back because it said, like so-and-so lived, for this, they gave you time. And so they could go back and identify that, the first, and I don't have the number in my hand, was like 240,000 years ago. It was a really long time ago, It was a really long time ago. And so I'm wondering if anyone has taking that document, done any kind of chronology to see how far back in time it goes.
Right. And definitely that Sumerian kings list is a real mystery, because it starts off with historic figures, just go farther and farther back. And they said, no, there were kings 100,000 years ago. And we don't have the archaeology for that. We don't know what it was like back then. They might tell you, we could kind of guess, but people don't actually know. And it's the same thing with the ancient Japanese histories, like the ones that people rely on for their history of like the 7th century or 8th century. It's the most reliable source, but you can trace it back from there, and you can go back to like 600 BC, and then in 600 BC it says this person was sent down from above, and he was given orders to go conquer the lands to the east. And you have to wonder, like, what was actually going on back then? This is the only source we have. So we kind of have to reason out from that, like, what does that actually mean?
Well, I'm thinking the lands to the east, but they're already in the east. So then,
right.
It kind of goes, okay, so was Mu or Lemuria, whatever name you want to put, was there that continent there, or was there a culture to the east for them to conquer?
Right. Well, actually, what it means in that text, we were starting out in the island called Kyushu, which is in the west, and for some reason that's where the Japanese people apparently came down from above, and then that land in the east is like what do you call it, like Tokyo or Kyoto and all those big cities. But on the other hand, in that same like official document, they're asked to build a place on the eastern shore of Japan, and they say you have to build a shrine here because it's facing the ancient distant land in the east, and no one knows what that is. And like the official like scientific commentators say, it was like a fairyland, it was some mythological thing. But why would they come from the east? Like you'd expect. If Japanese people were migrating east from like China or Korea or Mongolia or whatever, you'd expect their ancient homeland to be from the west. So why were they asked to build this shrine, which is still around today? Why on the east coast facing some distant land?
Well, that brings up another point. How are these texts taken as a whole by people, academia? Do they see them as being factual documents? Do they see them as being, the flight of fancy of a primitive mind?
Right. With the main mythologies that I put in chapter 1 of the book, they used to teach that in schools, like up to from like 500 AD or whatever. They said, in ancient times we had these kings, we had these like princes who went on adventures, and we had wars against this and that. And these days people are like, well, these are only sources, so we can't trust that. It's gone from being just supportive to mainly critical in the academy. And with the stuff I've put in the other chapters of my book, people don't even want to look at it. they'll just say people have been suckered into reading this, and it's not important at all. But I don't really agree with that. I think it is important, and if it's not important for historical reasons, it could be important for other reasons.
And the point I always like to make is if what they're writing down wasn't true and it was just some giant fantasy story like the Ramayana, that's huge.
Right.
That is a huge epic written in lyrical verse. Why write it down? Why write down the Epic of Gilgamesh if it's just a fairy tale?
Right. That's what I addressed in the conclusion, because I just feel like people do not give ancient people credit. Like people today just think, oh, they made it up for some reason or another, and like filling in that some reason or another is the job of the professors and stuff. But when you read these documents, it's really, reading the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the ancient Japanese texts, they're really talking to you about things that are relevant today. And there's so much complexity. There's just so much in them. And I feel like, people, especially in the West, especially in America, where we just want to shrug off stuff that happened in the past, people really need to give it a shot and look at what the ancient documents are saying, because I feel like people are really underestimating what the mind of the ancient human beings.
Yeah, and I feel like we kind of have stuff in common, because I like reading that old dried up dusty stuff that's sitting in somebody else's corner.
Right.
Okay, but I have to ask you, so have you read the Mahabharata?
Oh yeah, that was my thing last semester. For my little Eastern Classics program, we were all reading that, and it's just amazing. I mean, there's so much in there. Actually, the whole thing isn't translated yet. Can you believe that? I mean, it's the epic of India. Everyone in India has their translation, but in English, we only have about 7 out of 18 books or something like that. And I
think there are 15 that you can get. 11, 13.
There's like a public domain translation you can get online. Mm-hmm. But I was checking that against the one that we were using, and I realized, wow, there's a lot of mistakes. The guy was filling in stuff based on what he had heard from his friends or something like that. And I feel like we really need a good translation, and so you can actually really dig into the text, and that one's not done yet.
All right. I mean, I've tried reading that, and I got halfway through book 1, and I just couldn't track all the characters. I mean, it just, it wasn't this ongoing chronological thing, and it was kind of making me crazy, and I'm like, I'm going to move along. But I did read the Ramayana. I thought that was excellent.
Book 1 of the Mahabharata is called the Book of Creation, and so that's the theme. There's a lot of things are getting created, and when we picked that up, I feel like a lot of people, if it weren't for class, they would have just dropped it immediately, because there's just so much birth and so many stuff going on, and all the characters are flying by, and you really can't keep track of it. When you get into book 2, though, you're introduced to the main characters. And then things start getting a little more sane, although there's still enormous cast of characters like the Ramayana. But the idea of the Mahabharata is it has to cover everything that's ever happened in history and everything that will ever happen, right? That's what it said in the first chapter or something. So if it happened, it's in there. It's a really interesting idea for a book.
I believe that. I mean, because people ask me, well, so what was the Ramayana about? It's like, well, here's the basic storyline. I go, but they had to tell everything. It's like, well, Rama got up and he rubbed his eyes, and then he went down to 7-Eleven and got a cup of coffee, and then he went and brushed his teeth. I mean, it's just like, really, do we need to know all this detail? But
right. That's why the translation I was reading, I don't know if you have, it's like the blue one. It's like the short Ramayana, the speedy version, but it's still a lot of stuff happening.
Oh no, I read it. The one I read was 3 books long. It took me
wow.
months to get through it,
Mm-hmm.
but I really enjoyed it. But it was like, I mean, every little detail was in this book. Mm-hmm. But when you read and I didn't mean to go off on this whole tangent, the Japanese classics, and actually we never actually mentioned which 4 you talk about in your book, but when you read through those, are they just as detailed in their narratives?
Well, I was thinking about that just now. The Mahabharata is like so complex, right? And it's huge. It's the biggest book in the world, and there's so much detail about the different types of things that were possible in India at that time. And the Japanese books, I feel like Japan as a culture, it really likes that simplicity, that wabi-sabi, if you're familiar with that. And you see that in Japanese tea ceremonies, in music, in art, and it's also in these books that the world that's been handed down or presented to us in these books is a world where things could run simply. It's kind of Taoist in that way. Like there's a natural state that people like to be in, and it's been screwed up for us since then. But like way back in the day, things were really simple. Is like the main message of many of these books.
Mm-hmm. And not so much so far, and I think it's interesting because we find these magnificent, pottery or structures that come from this very ancient age, but then there's this major simplicity in the way that they live, and it's kind of this dichotomy almost going on.
Right. It's almost like they were putting more complexity into the pots than you can imagine in the culture, because they must have been like hunter-gatherers, right? They would go down to the river, spear some fish, and they'd be done with work for the day. But
well, I mean, that's what they would like for us to believe, but then there's a whole lot of different, we don't really know what their society was like and what the cultural base was like, and maybe it wasn't important. Anyway.
Right. That's the thing about this archaeology is we have these ornate pots, and what we have besides that is just people's speculation. Like you'll see this odd object, like the little figurine that looks like it has a submarine helmet on, and they say, oh, this is probably a religious object, and so you're wondering, oh, that just means they don't know. Right? We can't actually say what things were like back in that time. We don't have anyone to tell us. So these documents are giving us a window into what things might have been like.
Well, I think that it is how they were like, and anyway, that's.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So what are the 4 documents that you do go into the book, and why did you choose those documents?
Okay, the first one I chose mostly because it's the first one we heard of, because we have those 2 official mythologies, the Kojiki and the other one, and then in early modern times they said, no, wait, there's something that's much, much older than that. And so that's why I got into that whole story with the Buddhist monk, the Zen monk, and all of his stuff. That does have a very interesting message. But then we get to the second one, and that's called the Hotsumatsutai. And that story, like it's the one that's written entirely in haiku. It has its own writing system. Like it's not written in regular Japanese letters or Chinese letters. It has its own system that we don't find anywhere else. And they said this is the only manuscript that survives from this ancient culture, which I think is very interesting. After that, we have the Takenouchi documents, which describe this ancient golden age with the world emperor and this, like the world being divided up into these little nations, and the world emperor would come and visit all of them. and how like Jesus and Moses like came to Japan and studied the ancient texts and all of this kind of out there stuff. That's the Takenouchi documents.
No, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Jesus and Moses. I mean, did they call them Jesus and Moses, or somebody just like decided to call them that?
Well, what it says in the document is Yekrisu or something like that, and Mose Romulus. That's what it actually says, is that those folks had come over to Japan and studied the ancient teachings and went back to their home countries to propagate them.
That's interesting.
Yeah, that's really something, right? And in fact, there's a little village in the far north in Japan today that says it's like, this is where Jesus was buried. And it has a big cross there, and they do like ceremonies and stuff like that. And it's all links back to these Takenouchi documents. Like you can find the full story in the documents there.
And how late do they think, or early, or when do they think that document was actually written?
That's a good question, because it was supposedly kept secret throughout most of Japanese history, and then it was only like the father told his son, now is the time, the world is becoming closer together, the world's getting smaller, it's time to reveal the documents. That was 1920, so that's when we actually first hear about the document.
Okay, so I'm just going to be kind of blunt here. So have they like carbon-14 dated the paper, or done any kind of like?
Because that's the thing with these old documents is like they're the property of like shrines, and places that keep ancient texts, and those people don't want anyone else to look at it.
Well, then how can you know what it says?
That's a good question, because people were reading it back before they had carbon dating, like in 1920s and 30s, and they wrote their own books, and then the government suppressed it, and a lot of them got destroyed during that period.
Well, to say that Jesus and Moses were over there, it's either, in my mind, a very late document,
right?
Or it's something miraculous. And if it's going to be something miraculous, it would be nice to know that it was, before Western influence in the region.
Right. But to me, I could go and harass the guy who says that he has these ancient texts and say, oh, I want to get a copy of this and I want to examine it. But to me, the important thing is not if these totally amazing out there claims are actually happen historically. It's about the symbolic value, because when you think about Jesus and Moses, these are symbolic figures. They mean a lot to their respective traditions. And in Japan, we have they've got their own tradition, and so this document kind of links them together and says they're all part of the same one thing.
Okay, so how many documents did we get through?
That was the third one.
Okay.
The fourth one actually has a pretty interesting story behind it. As the story goes, is that this scientist was up in the woods taking measures of the Earth's geomagnetic field, and this sort of mountain man walked up to him and said, you need to stop doing your experiment here. It's making the animals unhappy. And so he does, and then the guy comes back and says, hey, thanks for doing that. Oh, by the way, I run this little shrine called Kata Communa. It's way off in the mountains. Very few people have heard of it. We have these ancient texts, and nobody will believe me when I say that they're really old. And so the guy shows the scientist these texts, and the scientist is just amazed. It looks like nothing else that he's ever seen in Japan. And so he copies them down in his notebook, and then later publishes them and says, this is from Japan about 10,000 years ago. And that's called the Kata Communa documents, and that's another one that's written entirely as poetry.
And so has that one been, is it in Japanese, or is it in one of these weird scripts that you were talking about before?
Right. It's in one of these unusual scripts that you don't see anywhere else. It's the scripts kind of look like circles. It's written with like circles and lines, and the script actually spirals out from the middle. Like it's not written left to right. It starts in the middle of a page and then it goes like spiraling outwards. And it's very unique type of thing to read and decipher. It's not, you can recognize it as Japanese, but all of the words have very distinct meanings.
Okay, so I'm getting a little lost there. So it's not written in Japanese, but how do they know what it says?
That's a good question. It seems like the people who were deciphering and publishing these, they felt like they had tapped into the real spirit of the documents, and they said, look, we have this word in Japanese, ma. It means a chance, like an opening, a possibility. And that must be the same thing way back when. And so they were able to get through it that way, and they linked together all these little syllables like u, ta, ma, and when they put them together, they got new words. So there's a lot of like spiritualism, a lot of revelation coming into the translation of those texts.
Well, you need to send them to Easter Island, and maybe they can figure out that Rongo stuff, and
exactly.
And we'd all be happy.
Right.
So what was your favorite part in going through all of these texts and digging into all of this history?
Well, I started out because I was reading about the Japanese mythology that we were talking about in the first part of this program, and someone had written online. There's a document that's older than these, but it's not accepted. People don't believe it, and so I started looking into that, and I was like, wow, it just puts images into your head. It gives you this impression of an ancient Japan from before we really know much about it, where there's like a drastically different kind of society. It didn't have the Buddhism or Confucianism or Taoism. It didn't have any of that. It was this an ancient native thing, and there's a lot of poetry and music, and just getting that image of ancient Japanese society was really cool for me.
I'll bet that would be. I mean, especially, coming from, the Western world, it's not something that you're exposed to. It's not something that we have familiarity with. I mean, if it was, digging into like Greek stuff or Roman stuff or even Egyptian stuff, we still have some vague familiarity with it because we're exposed to it in our Western culture. But when you start getting into China and Japan or India, I mean, we're not exposed to it, and it's just kind of a giant mystery.
Right, and I started out just thinking, well, this is really weird and unusual and foreign. What, like Jesus came to Japan? That's so strange. But then I started reading this different take on the philosophy of ancient texts that says all of these ancient traditions really have an esoteric, like, single origin, that it's a sort of metaphysical thing that people can come to understand by reading these ancient texts. And I was reading that, I was able to link it into the stuff that I had already read, and it started to get a lot clearer for me. Like, people didn't write it trying to be weird or surprise people. They were trying to express something with a deep symbolic value.
Cool. Well, I'm looking at the clock, and the music is going to come up any second. So, Avery, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No, you were great. You were great. So I'm going to let you go. Oh, where can people get your book? And is it available like on Kindle and Nook and all that good stuff?
Yeah, it's being sold by Inner Traditions. You can get it on Amazon or from your local bookstore if they have Inner Traditions books. And yeah, there's a Kindle version if you'd like to read it that way.
And your website, if somebody wants to get a hold of you?
Yeah, it's avery.morrow.name, although I'd have to spell it out, but it's whatever.
It's on the website, everybody. So go to justenergyradio.com and check it out. And actually, I think I have a link to your book on your little webpage. So if they are not really sure the name of the book, Go to the Just Energy Radio page, click on your link. There should be a link to the book. Actually, I could do that right now. There is. There is. They could just go to the webpage, click on your book, and just buy it right now.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome. Avery, a pleasure having you on the show, and I will talk to you soon.
All right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. That's Avery Morrow. His book is The Sacred Science of Ancient Japan, Lost Chronicles of the Age of the Gods. And next week, we're going to be speaking with Sasha Lesson about the Lost Book of Enki, and in the second hour with Stephen Knapp about the secret teachings of the Vedas. And so until next week, I'm Dr. Rita Louise. This is Just Energy Radio. Be blessed.
Join host Dr. Rita Louise each week at this time for Just Energy Radio